The pushers of the grand deception called the trans movement have been extremely effective in intimidating professionals into silence. But there are still a few within the world of psychology and mental health who care more about protecting vulnerable kids from harm than they do their own comfort and threats against their professional licenses. Professional therapist and author and speaker, Dr. Ann Gillies is one of those fearless champions of vulnerable gender-confused children and teens, daring to risk it all to ensure the truth is not silenced. We'll hear from her next on the Predator Watch podcast.
Predator Watch provides a brief overview of important stories in the news or issues of concern as they relate to understanding the nature of sexual predators, their characteristics, how their minds operate, their methods of manipulation, and what motivates them. They hide in plain sight, can smell an opportunity a mile away, and count on people not understanding just how dark their hearts are and how intent they are about always producing victims. Stay tuned as Jon Uhler, a licensed professional counselor with over 25 years of professional experience treating both survivors and sexual predators, shares his insights on this edition of Predator Watch.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jon Uhler, and welcome to Predator Watch podcast. It is my privilege to have on the other side of the screen Dr. Ann Gillies, who is a wealth of information and a wealth of knowledge from the Great White North, from up in Canada. Dr. Gillies, and thank you so much for being a part of our podcast.
It's very good to be here. I've loved just chatting with you for a few minutes prior and getting to know you a little bit.
Well, our paths have crossed a couple of times. We finally get a chance to get to know one another, but I found a podcast of yours, really a broadcast from a presentation you all did, you and a number of folks in Vancouver. Actually, it was not a presentation, it was a rally.
It was.
Do you want to set the stage for the clip I'm going to show that got me so excited to know that we're of kindred spirits in our desire to protect kids from what's happening in the trans movement? I call it the trans deception. But you have spoken out, and you did so magnificently, and we're going to cue this up because I want people to understand that they have in us, as they're listening to us, we have a total of over 25 years experience each, so a total of about 50 years combined working with folks, a lot of whom have been survivors and trauma survivors. And we both are very concerned what's going on with the trans movement and the harm that is being wrought upon kids.
Yes, and so this rally in Vancouver was basically about stopping child medical transitioning because we have great concerns over what's happening to children being put on puberty blockers and all of the things that are happening to young children that never happened up until about 2010, really started growing in momentum. Prior to 2002, there was no transgender stuff. It was gender identity disorder, but we won't get into that right now. You can go ahead and show the clip. It was about really protecting children.
Wonderful. And this can be seen on YouTube. We will certainly show it right now. This is under the Vancouver rally under Dr. Ann Gillies.
And I want to especially talk to the professionals. I want to talk to the psychologists, to the psychiatrists, to the psychotherapists. I was one for 25 years. I retired so I could become a voice in this place across Canada. And I want to say to the medical professionals, we have a problem of ethics. We have a problem of being professional. You have stopped practicing what you were trained to practice. Psychotherapists, you have stopped practicing and you are not telling people the truth. You're not telling the parents the truth. You're not telling the children the truth. This is absolutely malpractice. And medical doctors, so I have a friend who's a medical doctor, and we were talking, And I said to him, so what happens when a young child, a 12-year-old, comes into your office and they tell you that they're trans? And do you know what he told me? My heart just about went, yeah. He said to me, I just send them to another doctor that will help them, and they'll be back in 4 months because they'll decide it isn't any good. I'm thinking, what kind of a doctor is this? What is wrong with our professions? They have been drinking the Kool-Aid, quite honestly. They've been listening to the lies of the media, and we are promoting things that are harming children. This is child abuse, folks, and our medical professionals are in the midst of it. And why is that happening? That is happening because of the corruption of academia. It has been being corrupted since the 1950s.
Amen.
That's
why when I heard that, I thought you and I have to do a podcast together. I've been, in my own way, I've been sort of out in the hinterlands saying that, but there you were on the steps of, looks like, was that?
I think it was the library in Vancouver.
There you go. So you are on the hilltops shouting it. So say it again. Say it again.
Well, one of the things, it's not my typical counseling voice, that's for sure. But in order to be heard by the crowd, and then there was a transgender group that was very noisy, activists that were very noisy. But yeah, where are the medical professionals? Where are the psychologists and the psychiatrists and the mental health workers? And why are they not speaking out according to their training? Because honestly, those who have been trained in trauma care, child development, and those areas particularly know that there is something wrong here. There's something wrong when we are as they say, transitioning children into, I would guess, like their ideas, their thoughts, instead of allowing them just to grow into their own body experience. So that's, there's a lot of confusion out there. I think parents are so confused, but therapists, especially those who have been in the field for many years, really, I think that I know they've been threatened and intimidated. They'll lose their jobs if they speak out, because in Canada, we're only allowed to practice, in Ontario where I live, we're only allowed to practice affirmation only. So you can only affirm the child's thoughts and their decisions. And what 5-year-old has the capacity to know what it's like to be a boy if they're a girl, or vice versa? How do they know what that's like? And how will they know what that's like when they hit puberty? So, there's a lot of questions.
So, and let me, just for point of clarification for a parent or somebody that's watching, affirmation therapy simply is this, that you as a clinician, you are mandated at the point of threat of losing your license, you have to basically tell a child or tell a minor who comes to you and says, I think I'm born in the wrong body, which by clinical definition is a delusion. Okay. So a young person comes into therapy and says, if they're a girl, I think I'm a boy, or vice versa. And I, as a therapist, then have to affirm them. I can't challenge that. I can't help them think deeply. I simply have to fast track them. I'm facilitating them onto what? Now, is that correct? Did I describe that properly?
Yes, we're not allowed to explore their family histories. I mean, they're not giving us the opportunity to find out if this child has other comorbidities. For instance, quite a large percentage, have autism or are on the Asperger's spectrum. Many have been abused. Many have attachment disorders, and there are extenuating circumstances that are not being looked into for these children, and they're vulnerable. And so they're vulnerable to thoughts and suggestions. I mean, all children are vulnerable to suggestions. I mean, let's face it. And if those suggestions are repeatedly implanted in their mind, children absorb that. You know, we used to say garbage in, garbage out. Well, in my estimation, looking at what's going on in society and looking at our school system, there's a lot of garbage going into our children's minds. And it's literally, it's been confusing them and challenging them. And for those who are particularly vulnerable to the suggestions that, hey, you're in the wrong body, or even, and teachers have actually said, there's a lawsuit in Ottawa actually happening that a little girl came home from school, I think she was 6, and just absolutely distraught, because I think what the teacher said was, you cannot say you're a girl. You don't know. And I mean, this is ludicrous. When are we going to call a spade a spade? We are creating the greatest mental health crisis we've ever seen. It's devastating to our children and to future generations. And we are going to reap what we've sown in these kids' lives. I think it's unconscionable.
I concur. And you mentioned about the school system. I have asserted that without pornography and the influence of pornography, that the numbers found for the trans movement, whatever stats you want to find, we certainly have hard stats for kids that have been referred to gender therapy treatment. Those are pretty fact-based. But I assert that without porn and porn's influence and those that are using it, that the numbers within the trans movement would die back to the numbers we saw in 2005, which didn't exist, in essence. They weren't there.
Right.
When
we
you're
saw that as a
mentioning,
disorder.
okay. When you're mentioning about schools, are you also referring to the influence of porn in these kids that being used to confuse these kids and pornographic ideas?
Well, you know, I think here we even need to articulate what is pornography. You know, I'm old and I've started saying that. I don't want to say it, but I'm not, I've come from a past where I've watched the porn industry just explode. And I've had children that have gotten into porn, and it is so pervasive. And I would say, I mean, so if you go back 60 years, and porn, what was called porn then, has nothing on what is called porn now. So we have actually transitioned the whole porn industry. And so it was like if in Sears catalog, so most of you won't even know what that is, but we used to buy, it was on the phone through a Sears catalog.
I actually remember the Sears catalog.
Oh, yeah. Anyways, that dates me. But what I was going to say about that, in the women's section, underwear section, I mean, there was huge discussions over what they could and couldn't put in that section to advertise, because it could broach on pornography. Now, for goodness sake, I mean, there's no discussion. And so over the last 50, 60 years, we have seen such a radical change in what is embedded into our culture as far as healthy sexuality and the whole area of pornography. So pornography now, because of the internet, is just so invasive into children's lives. And I would say that much of what the children are learning, particularly in the area, certainly because they're learning Kinsey's Kinsey's continuum of sexuality, his theory that we are born bisexual. That was a theory. In fact, Kinsey's stuff is so, it was fraudulent. His research was fraudulent. It would never have made acceptance. And yet it did. It should never have. But the reality, where was it going with that, is that the children are being, I would say, indoctrinated from kindergarten on. And then you have, so then already they're taught to question, and they don't even understand sexuality. So they're questioning, and then they are now reading books that are talking about, the boy princess, and they're reading all of these things. So what's that doing to their mind is causing great confusion. It's all done in the name of inclusivity. But the reality is it's actually bringing porn into the classroom. And children are certainly at very young ages exposed to body parts and different things. And you can say, oh, well, they need to learn that. Yeah, well, they can probably learn some of that at home from their parents, and just the bare necessities for the age appropriate teaching. So I think we're seeing porn right from the earliest school grades right through.
And Anne, this is a perfect opportunity for me now to do a proper introduction. Let me read your bio, because I wanted you to have a chance to talk about a couple of books that you've written. And you, Dr. Anne Gillies, and you were trained jointly in professional counseling and theology, earning a Ph.D. in philosophy of professional counseling from Liberty University, with a primary focus in attachment theory, complex trauma, and sexuality. Your research revolved around attachment theory, child sexual abuse, same-sex attraction, and gender dysphoria. That's why we have the right person on the other side of the screen. You recently retired after 25 years of counseling focused primarily on individuals struggling with complex traumatic stress. So complex traumatic stress. You're an ordained minister, an international speaker, author, and founder of Restoring the Mosaic, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, a ministry which seeks to educate and inform politicians, community leaders, and pastors through conferences, seminars, and workshops across Canada.
I wasn't planning on writing a Deep Impact, the integration of theology and psychology on trauma. First, I thought I would write about closing the floodgates, which I saw this momentum happening, right? And in the whole sexual identity issue and the LGBTQ. So, but interestingly enough, before I went to write that book, I thought I just have to start putting some things down about trauma, and it became a book. So that is based on my professional experience. And I mean, I think as well as research, that book. But talking with you, you could have added so much more to it too. I mean, trauma is individual in the sense that it impacts each person individually in perhaps a little bit different way. And that makes it interesting to treat and difficult to treat. And not saying that there aren't similarities. Absolutely. When you have child sexual abuse, and those are the typical clients that you see, I most often saw the survivors of child sexual abuse, and most often women. So that was my population of interest particularly. And so I got pretty good at being able to recognize the trauma that they weren't talking about sometimes, and to know what questions to use and what probes to use. So anyways, that was my professional experience. And then closing the floodgates comes more from a research perspective, and definitely out of my passion for children, for parents, for families, and what I see happening, the destruction of the family. So closing the floodgates is really tracking the sexualization of our culture from 1950 right up to now. And it really is a call to action for parents. So I was writing that in 2016. That was just before the what we call in Canada the trans pronoun bill went to Parliament and was passed. And Jordan Peterson was speaking out about that. So so much was happening in that time. So I think, the sexualization and understanding the sexualization of our nations is really, really important. And parents are so unaware. Pastors, clergy are unaware. And so they aren't they're strategic in how they take care of people, I would say.
And that's where our interest merges. We both worked with survivors. We both then can see what's happening with these kids, that kids are being primed, as it were. They're being exploited. They're being taught about things that they have no concept of figuring out whether or not it's true. Kids will believe what they're told. Now they're being taught something that goes against basic biology, that they can be born in the wrong body. So that's a fantasy. And then they're introduced concepts that really start to become very deviant in terms of sexuality. Now they're being groomed and scripted. And many of them are ripe for being abused or have already been abused. And now they're traumatized. And so they come to a therapist. And if a therapist doesn't understand trauma,
That's right.
if a therapist has drunk the Kool-Aid, as you've used that term, and
I
it's
use
perfect
that term, oh dear.
right? But that term is perfect because it comes out of the Jonestown cult situation. That's why we use the term drunk the Kool-Aid. Right? Jim Jones took his group, he was a pastor, supposedly, took his congregation, went down to Guyana, and he eventually had them drink cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. So now that's become euphemistic for anybody that believes a lie.
It's really interesting that you draw that analogy, because it's so important. Because what we are doing in our nations, and this is why I was speaking at that rally, which was about stopping medical transitioning of children, we are poisoning our children with puberty blockers and hormones. So we are literally, and therapists and those and medical doctors who are part of that, my heart just breaks, because I'm like, where are the ethics in this? What are you doing? Even if your associations tell you that you just have to affirm that you have to affirm these children's thoughts and their delusional thoughts, because you cannot be in another body. It is not, no matter what is being spewed out there and taught, a girl can never, ever, ever really become a man, and vice versa. Although you can do all the surgeries, and there will be multiple, and you can go on lifelong drugs, and you can change your appearance, but will you ever, ever be the other sex? So I would say that, the therapists, we as a society have drank the Kool-Aid. It's a very scary time in our culture. And the children are the ones who are suffering. They are going to suffer. And we're hearing that more and more as there's more what we call now detransistors that are speaking out. And I know in Canada, we have some detransistor groups, and I'm so thankful that they are brave enough to speak out about their experiences, because they were never informed of the consequences.
A lot of what drove me to transition in the first place was linked to a lot of mental health issues and a lot of stuff that I had going on.
Nobody in the medical or psychological field ever tried to dissuade me to offer other options.
The fact that I was so obsessed, this should have been some sort of red flag to someone somewhere.
there were all these red flags, and I honestly wish that somebody had pointed them out to me, and then I might not have transitioned in the first place.
How many of you feel that you were blindly affirmed?
I didn't get enough pushback on transitioning. I went for 2 appointments, and after the second one, I had my letter to go get on cross-sex hormones.
2 visits? That's it?
And the therapist that I found only required 1 therapy session in order for her to be comfortable writing this letter for me.
The therapist that I got, she actually told me that she could get me all the paperwork that I needed to transition that after my first session.
But I mean, of course, hindsight, because back when I wanted to take hormones, I thought Planned Parenthood, oh my God, this is like a godsend. I don't have to go, because I didn't want to talk to a therapist. So I don't have to jump through any hoops. I don't have to do anything. I just walked in and got it.
And I want you to repeat that because that's key, right? In any medical procedure, including psychological procedure, so to speak, but in any medical procedure, right, we all know, we go to the doctor, and even if it's medication, we're supposed to be given all the side effects. Matter of fact, that gets scary when you see all those, if you're watching on TV and it causes all sorts of things, and you think, is the cure worse than the disease? But why do they do that? It is for informed consent. And informed consent takes into account both the facts and the details of what, if I'm a medical professional, which I'm not, but it takes into account the nature of the procedure. So I have to fully disclose so that the person is tracking with me, so that they can give full consent, meaning they're fully aware of everything about this that they're about to undertake. And what you said is so key. So repeat that again about medical professionals are not following through on that most basic responsibility, that ethical responsibility to make sure that their patients who have untreated mental health issues in this case are not being fully informed, and neither are the parents.
I wanted to find ways of dealing with my gender issues that aren't medically transitioning, and those ways weren't presented to me. The only solution that was presented was chopping your breasts off, injecting yourself with hormones, and becoming a man.
Well, this is certainly what the detransistors are saying, and I would agree. And there's now website groups that will help parents to understand some of these things. But what we've recognized is that those who are gender affirming therapists, and basically, well, I was going to say that basically in Ontario, that's every therapist. They have to be gender affirming. So that means that if a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old child comes to their office, they have to affirm that child's belief that they are the opposite gender. And let's get gender and sex figured out here. There's a big difference between gender and sex. Gender is the way you express your femininity or your masculinity. It is not your sexuality. And everything has got so muddied that we don't even talk about sex anymore, which it's almost like if you say sex, that's not a very good thing to say. Well, yeah, we are sexual beings, absolutely. And we are born male or female, sorry. And there are a very, very minority that are intersex. I'm not even going to get into that. I was talking to an intersex young man yesterday, and he's very upset that he's included in the trans umbrella because it's a medical condition. It is not a psychological one. Anyways, where was I going? So parents are not being informed of the harms. And so we are to do no harm, and we are harming the parents, the families, and particularly the children. And so putting children on puberty blockers, and most often the drug of choice is Lupron, which was, and I'm wondering how many parents were ever told that Lupron is used to treat cancer, and that it is, there have been many, I think it's something like between 10 and 20,000 FDA reports against Lupron itself. And so children are experiencing all kinds of problems, physical problems, being put on Lupron. And it was used to help children who were not growing fast enough. And so to suppress the puberty until their body caught up physically. But that was a small minority too. And now medical doctors and psychiatrists are putting children on these drugs. And they are basically, once a child, and in Canada, children can actually go on these drugs at 10 years of age. So prepubescent children, and the goal is to get them on early so they will never experience puberty. And then once they are on puberty blockers and they continue on them through what would be the normal time of puberty, they will be put on hormone supplements. And those, so what we're doing is we are actually crystallizing their gender identity, because they will not, if they've been through the whole process of the puberty blockers, they are almost 100% going to become gender identified. And so there's that portion. They will be on those hormones then for life. And they will most likely, and this is affirmation therapists and doctors, will be, and these are gender clinics, of course, these children now go to. They'll go on the puberty blockers. Then as soon as they're old enough, that body mutilation will be recommended. They should have their breasts removed because they want to be the opposite gender, so they need to look like that. And so their genitalia. So we are mutilating our children. And who is speaking up? And what therapists are starting to speak up? I'm not hearing them. And it breaks my heart, because I'm thinking, everything you went to school to learn, you are actually throwing out the door to actually treat people with the underlying issues. The underlying issues aren't addressed, they aren't explored, and that just breaks my heart.
I soon ended up going to a children's mental hospital in my state because I was so depressed that I wasn't going to school, and my parents didn't know what to do. So they sent me to the mental hospital for about 10 days, and that didn't help. I think I was at the point where it actually kind of made it worse. And I started, pretty soon after that, when I came back, I was still cutting myself and still depressed. It didn't do anything. I still wasn't going to school.
There are so many overlapping or interlacing conditions that can be confused for gender, like for a need to transition, or can cause dysphoria. And going through the massive list that nobody ever really went over with me as a kid.
Something I did as a reaction to what was going on around me, with my toxic relationship. I hate using that word, but that's really what it was. And like my really difficult home life, and my struggles with school, and my struggles with severe anxiety and depression, and, autism, blah, blah, blah. The list goes fucking on and on. And it was just like the only way that I could express what was going on inside of me.
I felt all my life like I had this terrible, painful gender dysphoria that basically just debilitated me, and I wasn't able to function because the depression was so bad. It's just that, I spent a lot of years, because of trauma, super dissociative. my dissociations were different. It wasn't like I became these other people, but I do have these other people in my head. Actually, part of what led me to transition is a bunch of these personalities are male. These facets of my personality are male or male presenting. And that sort of made me feel like, well, I'm everything, you know, like I'm not just a woman, I'm a man too. Almost like this non-binary type thing.
So these gender confused young people, and this is my passion as well. It really comes down to this for me, having worked with many, many troubled teens, severely emotionally disturbed kids. They are all messed up in all sorts of ways. A significant number of them have been perpetrated upon as far as sexual abuse. So if a child is sexually abused, a number of things happen simultaneously for that child. The issue of their intuition gets all inverted because a perpetrator has to override a child's intuition or a victim's intuition. Unless the perpetrator is going to hold a gun to that child's head, how do you get a child to stay there and take it and actually tell themselves that there's something positive about this? Because you have to convince them. That's what every cult leader does to those in the cult that are about ready to drink the Kool-Aid. That's what every sociopath or psychopath, white-collar psychopath, does. They convince people of something that's not true. Whether it's religion to get rich quick, and the majority of those guys also are perpetrating against women in that congregation. They are wolves. And the one thing about predators is they have to disarm the victim of their intuition. So these kids have no ability to reality test, right? They have no longer the ability to kind of think within themselves saying, something's not right about this. So they are sitting ducks for a persuasive person who's going to use them in some capacity, including financially for all they're worth, as long as they've got another step to go to help the surgeon make over $100,000 per procedure, put them on a lifetime of these pharmaceuticals. Well, who's benefiting from that? This has become a multi-trillion-dollar industry worldwide.
Oh, absolutely.
You, as a matter of fact, you did a podcast. Let me recommend your YouTube podcast. You want to describe that for a moment? Because in one of those, you talk about Rothblatt and how much money the pharmaceuticals are making.
So I want to talk about following the money of the transgender empire. The first person I want to identify here is called Martin Rothblatt. Now, Martin is the founding father, so to speak, of this empire and at the heart of the emerging gender identity industry. And an industry it is. There are now well over 60 clinics, gender clinics in the US alone, and many in Canada and throughout the West. It is an industry making a lot of money on the backs of our children.
For the first time in history, a marginalized group has a dollar sign attached to it. It's because there's a dollar sign attached to it. It's the fact that, Lupron makes $24,000 a year for every child that gets on hormone blockers.
Right now, we get between 70 and 90 referrals a month.
So if we take a study that was done in a very small area of the UK that had 97 kids, and we fast forward several years, and that 97 goes to over 4,000, we're talking about $2 million worth of revenue to over $100 million in revenue. Now multiply that by the world. This is $1 billion industry. And we're going to have a suicide epidemic that this world has never seen. And the people that are pushing medical transition, like the Susie Greens, the Mermaids, the Luprons, the Dr. Cranes, all these people that are monetizing things, it has nothing to do with love. It has to do with they have a dollar sign on their head. And that is a really sad place to be in society, because if we get to the point where we throw kids under the bus for money, we might as well just, come out of our houses and live with animals.
I mean, in 2015, it was worth 9.9 something billion dollars, the LGBT market. Now it's worth $3.6 trillion in 5 years. I mean, that's wild.
Yes, it's just a short, and it's not that I'm an expert in all of in this area. It's kind of been, it's an ongoing learning process for me with this whole money thing. And I was absolutely shocked at the billionaires that are funding this transgender. And so the transgender word itself is not a medical word. It's not a psychological word. It is an activist word for a phenomenon, what I would say. And the billions of dollars. So the money going into this to actually fund the propagation of the information about transgender is sponsored by billionaires. Some of them themselves are trans. So I think it is Jennifer Pritzker that actually he has certainly through different organizations funded clinics and also some university gender studies. I think they're in Vancouver and also in Toronto. He's funded some gender studies, given money for those studies in universities. So we need to be informed. There's a lot at stake here. And yes, big money to be made. So in pharmaceuticals, and Spitzer family has tremendous investments in pharmaceuticals. And that's just one. And there's many more. And so, it's big business riding on the backs of our children. And so they have a vested interest in making sure that children start transitioning in big groups. And that's really what's happening. So my YouTube is Dr. Ann Gillies, Restoring the Mosaic. So there's some interesting things in there. They're just kind of on my phone YouTube. So
they're well done. Do you want to describe how you chose the name Restoring the Mosaic?
Yeah, that was interesting. I have this passion that even if, we're not going to reach all these children. And so sometimes we will have to pick up the pieces. And that's what I believe so many of us, when we finally begin to stand up and speak out about what's happening, we're going to end up picking up the pieces of children's lives. So when we think about that, and also for me, it was, if you notice, the logo has the Canadian flag on. And for me, Canada has gone a long way from its foundations morally and governmentally. And so to restore Mosaic means to put those pieces together in a beautiful way, because we as individuals are so different. Whether we're LGBTQ or Christian or Jewish or, and we are all different. But to restore Mosaic means to bring it back to its original beauty in a way that all the pieces come together. They're all broken. There's shards of glass, and I don't know much about doing that kind of work, but it's all these little pieces. But when they're all put together, they're very beautiful. And I think the hope is that individuals and collectively, that we can come together and have healing. It may look like different pieces and different brokenness, but it's all put together in a beautiful way. So, and I'm a Christian, and I like to think that, I do believe that God takes our brokenness and our woundedness when we give it to him and really brings us into a new place and heals the woundedness. It doesn't happen usually overnight. It takes some time, but that's our mosaic.
I want to recommend closing the floodgates, setting the record straight on gender and sexuality. It's imperative that people learn what's happening through the trans movement or within the trans movement, the trans deception. It is real in the sense this thing is moving like a juggernaut.
Yes.
But it has been constructed out of thin air. It's the most brilliant marketing campaign that we've ever seen. And it is destroying kids. It's taking kids that have trauma. It's taking kids that have mental health issues, oftentimes from trauma, as you said, also on the autism spectrum. And people are playing with these kids as far as playing with their minds, confusing them, making them ripe for predators. And you have addressed in one of your YouTubes as well, you've addressed pedophiles. Pedophiles are having a heyday with kids that are within the trans movement. Because a pedophile is very adept at crossing boundaries, at grooming, and these kids are already susceptible, because they don't have their intuition, to trusting and believing. And then with how saturated with pornified or pornographic material, now these kids don't know that the perpetrator is showing them these things for a different reason. And they're dumbing down their intuition and therefore crossing boundaries. And before you know it, the young person not only thinks they're bi, but pansexual, and they don't realize it's the result of having their boundaries crossed. So, Dr. Gillies, any last thoughts that you want to share with parents or any professionals or any pastors?
I have tons of thoughts. We could talk for hours, but what I would really challenge professionals. I believe that many of you, if you're listening, have questions about what you've been told, because it doesn't add up to what you have been taught prior to 2010 or even a little bit earlier. So those of you who practice for some time, I believe that your conscience needs to kick in, and you need to allow it to kick in so that you don't just go with the cultural mandate as it is, but you start questioning it. You need to question it, and you need to go back to protecting children, and especially those who are trauma therapists and who deal with families and parenting and understand attachment disorders, that you need to really look at going back to the roots of your education and getting accurate information from the child and from their parent, so that you understand what's brought this child to this place, this time, because you can bet that there's some kind of trauma, and there's been certainly a lot of, I will call it indoctrination now. Before, you could identify trauma a little bit easier than you can now because of all the porn that's happening with these kids. So that's for therapists. Pastors and leaders, you're in also a precarious place, because in Canada now, it's going to be, if the current federal bill is passed, it's going to make it illegal for you to talk to children about same-sex attraction or their gender identity, unless you are also affirming their thoughts. And so,
as a matter of fact, Dr. Gillies, would you speak to that bill?
Oh, how much time do we have?
That's right. We have enough. So help Canadians get involved, help them take this seriously, because if this thing passes,
oh my goodness,
they're in real trouble. They're in real trouble.
Well, excuse me for the noise of the paper, because I was going to talk about this. So I'm going to read the criteria, what they say that conversion therapy is. So this is not actually a psychological term really either. There's no course where therapists can take conversion therapy, but this is what the definition, federal definition in Canada says. Conversion therapy means a practice. And I would say that, well, that's any practice, right? A practice, treatment, or service designed to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual or gender identity to cisgender. So cisgender is basically identifying in as male or female. Or, get this, to repress or to reduce non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior. We can treat individuals if they are heterosexual and wanting to become homosexual, gay, lesbian, or they want to become gender identified. So it also says this: for greater certainty, this definition does not include a practice. And I would say any practice instead of a, because that's what they're saying, any practice, treatment, or service that relates to a person's gender transition. So conversion therapy, in my sense, I mean, we are converting these young children. We're helping them transition from their biological sex into their gender identity. But for here, the definition is that conversion therapy doesn't mean that does not include practice or treatment that relates to a person's gender transition or to a person's exploration of their identity or their development. So we can't help children. Therapists can't help children. And this is a really, really horrendous bill before the Parliament right now, because it means that children and parents will not, if they are if gender confused, and I'll use that word because there's so much confusion out there, if they're gender confused and go to a doctor or go to a therapist and want help with the confusion and understanding if there are underlying circumstances, we can't treat the child. The only thing that we can do is affirm what the child's thoughts are. And that's really sad. And same with same-sex attracted children. Therapists can't explore any of the underlying, and there probably are lots of underlying trauma and other issues that have come, perhaps attachment issues. That's well tracked in research. We can't do that. And this bill is going to stop therapists, and not only the therapists, because it says any practice or treatment, it, even though they deny that it will shut down pastors from talking to their youth or anything, or even saying to their youth, well, the Bible says that any sexual behavior outside of marriage is sinful. And you can say that to a heterosexual child that is wanting to have sex with their going steady or whatever, but you can't say that to a same-sex attracted person. And the same with the gender identity. You cannot tell them that they are actually born male or female. So it's pretty horrendous where we've come to.
Canadians had better take it seriously. There's a father sitting in jail right now, in Canada, because he refused to refer to his child as the opposite gender, and he's in jail right now. This is coming to the U.S. as well. It's already now in Victoria in Australia. This is marching forward.
And that father, in all honesty, that's where it started. In the fact that he was not going to call his, I'm just confused here. It's a daughter. It was a daughter, right?
Correct.
That's transitioned. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't. It was his little girl. He said, "You're my little girl. You're not a boy." That's where it started. And then later he got charged with breaching the court order of not in order not to identify her. So, yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, most Canadians are completely oblivious. You know, they don't understand. They don't know what conversion therapy bans are. They really don't. And most pastors and churches, there are some waking up. I want to tell you that we've been making some progress there. But, you know, it's like, well, that won't really affect us until it does. And it will drastically affect them. And so this bill is probably the most far-reaching into the churches that I've ever seen, because it will basically begin to dictate what we say, how we preach, how the pastor preaches, what he preaches about. And, you know, I want to say that it is, and I did say this at the rally, that it is loving and kind to tell the truth. And when we're lying to children and we're repressing and suppressing the truth, we're not being kind and loving. And the same thing with other people that are hurting. We need to tell them the truth, and they don't always want to hear the truth. How many times have you had clients walk out or want to walk out because, you know, no matter how gently you may, you know, tell them something that they don't want to hear, they can take offense. That's just the way it is. But that doesn't mean we stop telling the truth. We tell it lovingly and kind. It's up to the person whether they receive it.
And I call that bill the Predator Protection Act. Because if you're a perpetrator, this is the greatest means of protection that has ever been devised. Because now I can have access to a kid. I can have access to someone else's child. I can begin to groom them. And like a cult, I can begin to bring them into my sphere of influence. And once the child begins to become attached to me, and that's why schools are so strategic for predators, and they work in concert with one another. There are predator rings that have certain members of their rings in certain professions. And now we're grooming a kid. A kid now all of a sudden says, "What?" And we have been able to identify that child in school. And by the time you as the parent know, we've already got our claws into this child. We've got enough hooks in this child emotionally and relationally to where the child now is coming over to them, meaning the perpetrator. And by the time the parent awakens, it's too late, because now I'm going to advocate on behalf of that child. That child now becomes my child. In
Exactly. Exactly. They are taking the place of the parent. And the pedophiles, I mean, they're very astute in grooming. And so the reality is they specifically target children, particular children, vulnerable children from single-family households, mom without a dad, young boys who haven't a dad and are looking for a father figure. And let me tell you, they look for a father figure. And so this man comes into their lives and has all the attributes they're looking for. And it's like a spider catching a fly in their web. It's horrendous. And earlier, and I'll just share this with you. Children are groomed from very, very young ages, and I've shared this just a couple times. But my first husband groomed his children and manipulated many, many people, including me, very well. And my eldest son has said that, it started so early in his life. We found out that it started so early in his life. And he said that this is what he thought love was. Being raped by his father is what he thought love was, because he had been groomed to believe that. And it took a long time of him coming to himself and recognizing what had actually happened. And so we have children that have been groomed in many, many different ways. But the fact that the schools are part of this grooming now and the sex ed curriculum, and I know people will say, well, we need to teach the kids sex ed. Yes, age appropriate, not what we're doing in the schools now. And it's just horrendous. It's a travesty.
Dr. Gillies, thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for speaking from experience, as well as from education, having worked with survivors. You and I together as therapists are trying to reach out to parents, trying to help spread the word that the trans movement is nothing but a ruse that is harming kids, harming gender-confused kids, many of whom have mental health issues. And that's why I'm so appreciative that you've taken the time to be with us, be with me on the program. And I so appreciate your time, and we will have to do this again.
Thank you. I would love to.
We'll look forward to it.
You've been listening to Predator Watch, dedicated to shining the light of truth about the nature of the most sophisticated of sexual predators most likely to target places where victims are most easily accessed. For Jon Uhler and the entire team, thanks for listening.
Predator Watch has been sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. As a nonprofit organization, Survivor Support is dependent upon the generosity of people who believe in its mission of supporting survivors. Please consider becoming a monthly supporter of this important work.